The streets of Uruk hum with purpose. Circa 3,200 BC, on the flat alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, canals flow in geometric precision between temple districts, carrying water from the Euphrates to fields that stretch toward a horizon unmarked by natural boundaries. The city breathes with an orderly rhythm, farmers tending crops, merchants weighing silver, scribes bent over clay in the cool shade of administrative buildings. Everything moves as if choreographed by invisible hands reaching across centuries, as if the movements themselves are older than the people performing them, inherited gestures in an endless choreography of civilization. The morning light catches the canal water, turning it briefly to bronze as it flows between reed-lined banks. These channels are not natural watercourses but deliberate excavations, precisely graded to maintain flow without erosion, sophisticated enough to include distribution gates and drainage systems that would not look entirely out of place in a modern agricultural region. The engineering speaks of deep understanding not just of water and soil, but of mathematics, of hydraulic principles, long-term planning that must account for seasonal variations and long-term sustainability. Watch the farmers as they work. Their movements are efficient, economical, refined through repetition until they achieve an almost meditative quality. They know exactly when to open sluice gates, exactly how much water each section of field requires, exactly which crops to plant in which locations based on subtle variations in soil composition and drainage patterns. This is not the tentative experimentation of pioneers, but the confident execution of established practice. They learned from their fathers, who learned from their fathers, who learned from... But here the chain of transmission fades into a past that no one can quite articulate. In the temple complex, a scribe sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a damp clay tablet balanced on his knee. The tablet is fresh, still soft, waiting to receive the wedge-shaped impressions that will harden into permanent record. His stylus, a carefully shaped reed with a triangular tip, moves with practiced efficiency, pressing wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface with a motion so automatic it seems almost unconscious. Years of training have made the movements instinctive. He does not think about forming the signs any more than we think about forming letters when we write. The shapes flow from hand to clay as naturally as speech flows from mouth. But what is he recording? Not poetry celebrating divine creation, not myths of gods breathing life into the first humans. Though such myths surely exist in oral tradition, not heroic tales of mighty kings, though kings sit enthroned just meters away. He is tallying grain rations, barley allocated to workers, beer distributed to temple servants, silver paid for imported timber. The precision is striking standard measurements, consistent accounting methods, administrative terminology that suggests not just years but generations of refinement. Each line on the tablet follows a formula so established it has become invisible. Recipient's name, occupation, amount received, date calculated according to a calendar that tracks lunar months and seasonal festivals with astronomical precision. The tablet before him is one of thousands produced this year in Uruk alone, part of an administrative system of staggering complexity and scope. Temple complexes employ hundreds of workers, farmers, herders, fishermen, weavers, potters, metal workers, brewers, bakers, construction laborers, guards, and the scribes themselves who record all this activity. Each worker receives rations according to status and task. Each transaction must be recorded, verified, archived. The system tracks not just current distributions but also debts owed, obligations incurred, contracts agreed upon seasons or years in the past. How did such a system come to exist? This is not simple village accounting, where a headman might remember who owes what through personal relationships and oral agreements. This is bureaucracy on an urban scale, requiring standardized procedures, trained specialists, institutional memory that transcends any individual's knowledge. The infrastructure necessary to support such administration, not just the physical archives, but the conceptual frameworks, the agreed-upon conventions, the training institutions represents an enormous investment of collective effort and intellectual sophistication. Yet there is no evidence of earlier, simpler systems from which this complexity evolved. The earliest administrative tablets we possess are already using the system at full capacity, already employing the complete range of accounting techniques. It is as if bureaucracy springs into being fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's head, with all its categories and protocols already established. Above him, the ziggurat rises against the pale sky like a mountain conjured from human will. Its mud-brick terraces climb toward heaven, each level smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid that dominates the landscape for miles in every direction. From the surrounding farmland, from approaching trade routes, from the river itself, the ziggurat is the first thing travelers see. An artificial mountain rising from plains so flat that the curvature of the earth is the primary limit on vision. The structure is massive, its base covers an area equivalent to several modern city blocks, and its height would dwarf most medieval European cathedrals. Yet it is built entirely of sun-dried mud brick, the only building material available in abundance in this stoneless landscape. Millions of bricks, each shaped by hand, each dried in the sun, each laid with mortar made from more mud. The logistics of such construction stagger the imagination. The organization of labor, the supply of materials, the architectural planning necessary to ensure stability as height increases and weight accumulates. But consider what is most striking. This was not trial and error made visible. There are no partially collapsed experiments in ziggurat building lying abandoned in Uruk's vicinity. There are no obvious design flaws that had to be corrected in later iterations. The ziggurat stands complete, its proportions refined, its engineering sound. Whoever designed it understood principles of stress distribution and weight-bearing that would not be formally mathematized for millennia. They knew how to create a stable artificial mountain from the least promising building material imaginable. At its summit, a shrine dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, a pairing of domains that seems contradictory to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in Sumerian cosmology, where both love and war represented, the crossing of boundaries, the mixing of what should remain separate, the passion that disrupts order whether in bedroom or battlefield. Her sacred precinct is aligned with astronomical precision to Venus, the wandering star that bears her name, whose movements across the night sky follow patterns both predictable and complex. The alignment is not casual or approximate. The shrine's orientation marks specific positions where Venus rises at key moments in its cycle. Venus is not a simple wanderer, but follows an intricate 8-year pattern, appearing as both evening star and morning star, disappearing for periods of conjunction with the sun, then reappearing in predictable sequences. To track this pattern requires years of careful observation, mathematical calculation to predict future appearances, and architectural precision to encode that knowledge in stone and brick. The moon's phases are tracked from these heights with equal care. The Sumerian calendar is lunisolar, attempting to reconcile the moon's cycle with the solar year, a mathematical challenge that every agricultural society faces and solves differently. The moon completes a cycle in roughly 29.5 days. 12 lunar months total only 354 days, 11 days short of a solar year. Left uncorrected, the calendar drifts relative to seasons, and agricultural timing becomes unreliable. The Sumerians solved this through intercalation, adding extra months at specific intervals to keep lunar months aligned with seasonal agricultural necessities. But who calculated when these corrections should occur? How many generations of observation were necessary to establish the pattern? The precision visible in Uruk's astronomical alignments suggests long-term data collection and mathematical sophistication that should have left traces. Preliminary attempts, simpler early buildings with cruder alignments, texts documenting the discovery process. Yet such traces are strikingly absent or extremely rare. The Pleiades mark the seasons. The priests who climb these stairs know the celestial rhythms as intimately as the pulse in their own wrists. But here is the unsettling thing, the detail that whispers wrongness into this scene of confident mastery. The temple appears ancient, not recently built and still settling. Ancient, as if it has stood here for time beyond measure, its rituals already old when the oldest living priest was born. There are no visible signs of experimentation, no half-finished attempts at architecture or abandoned design schemes. The ziggurat stands complete, its proportions refined, its purpose unquestioned. It is not the work of pioneers feeling their way towards something new. It is maintenance, preservation, the continuation of something already perfected. Walk through the craft workshops lining the streets that radiate from the temple complex like spokes from a hub. Here you can observe the full range of Sumerian technical mastery, each craft a demonstration of specialized knowledge accumulated and transmitted across generations. Pottery wheels spin at speeds carefully controlled by skilled feet, producing vessels of remarkable uniformity. The potter's movements are precise, economical, a finger pressed just so to create a rim, a wooden tool drawn along the surface to smooth it, a swift cut to separate finished vessel from wheel. The shapes are standardized. Water jars with specific capacities, storage vessels for grain, fine serving, bowls for elite households, ceremonial vessels for temple use. Each type has an established form that customers recognize and trust. But the real sophistication appears in the firing process. Pottery left merely to air dry remains fragile, vulnerable to water. Firing transforms clay chemically, driving out water molecules trapped in the crystalline structure and creating ceramic that is waterproof and durable. This transformation requires kilns that can reach and maintain temperatures of 800 to 1000 degrees Celsius, far hotter than any natural fire. The kiln design must allow sufficient airflow to sustain combustion while retaining enough heat for proper firing. Load the kiln incorrectly and pieces crack or explode. Fire too quickly and moisture trapped in the clay expands explosively. Fire too slowly or at too low a temperature and the pieces remain porous and weak. Sumerian potters have mastered all these variables. Their kilns produce consistent results, batch after batch, year after year. Someone at some point learned through hard-won experience how to construct a kiln, how to stack pottery within it, how to feed fuel to maintain temperature, how to know when firing is complete. This knowledge is now transmitted master to apprentice as established practice, but the original discovery process, the failures, the gradual improvements, the breakthroughs, these are not preserved in any record we possess. Metal workers cast bronze tools, using techniques that require even more precise knowledge. Bronze is an alloy typically 90% copper and 10% tin. This ratio is not arbitrary. Pure copper is too soft for most tools and weapons. Add too little tin and the bronze remains weak. Add too much and it becomes brittle. The 90/10 ratio represents an optimum discovered through experimentation, codified through practice, and maintained through careful attention to proportions. But here's what's remarkable. Copper and tin do not occur together naturally. Copper ores are found in mountainous regions far from Mesopotamia. Tin is even rarer, sourced from deposits in modern Afghanistan or even farther afield. The creation of bronze in Sumer requires long-distance trade networks, smelting techniques for two different metals, and metallurgical knowledge of how to combine them in correct proportions. This is not simple technology stumbled upon accidentally. This is complex technical achievement, requiring sophisticated understanding of materials and their properties. Watch a bronzesmith at work. The crucible glows orange-hot over a charcoal fire fed by bellows pumps that force air through the coals, raising temperatures high enough to melt metal. The smith adds carefully measured amounts of copper and tin, ingredients obtained through trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. He knows from experience or from training received from his master exactly when the alloy has reached the right consistency for pouring. Too cool and it won't flow properly into the mold. Too hot and it may crack the mold or create brittleness in the final product. He pours the molten bronze into a clay mold carved with the negative shape of whatever tool or weapon is being produced. The mold itself represents another layer of skill. It must be shaped precisely, dried to exact specifications, and able to withstand the thermal shock of molten metal without cracking. After cooling, the mold is broken away to reveal the casting, which is then ground, polished, and sharpened to final form. Every step in this process requires specific technical knowledge. Every step presents opportunities for failure, yet the Sumerian bronze works show no signs of being early, crude attempts. The objects are well made, consistent, produced according to standards that suggest mature technological tradition. Where are the failed experiments? Where are the primitive early attempts that should precede this level of mastery? Weavers work looms of sophisticated design, their hands moving in complex patterns to interlace warp and weft threads into fabric. The looms themselves are technological marvels, wooden frames designed to hold dozens or hundreds of parallel threads under tension, while allowing cross threads to be passed between them in precise patterns. Different weaving patterns create different textile properties. Plain weave for basic fabric, twill for strength and drape, more complex patterns for decoration. But understanding a loom requires more than watching someone use one. The weaver must understand how tension affects the final fabric, how different threads behave, how pattern variations create different results. This understanding comes from experience, from making mistakes and learning from them, from gradually refining technique over many attempts. A skilled weaver makes the process look effortless, but effortlessness is the outcome of mastery built on extensive practice. Yet nowhere do you see the trials and errors that should accompany innovation. No piles of broken pottery from unsuccessful firing attempts. No failed bronze castings discarded in workshop middens. No partially completed looms abandoned because the design didn't work. The work is already skilled, already standardized, already refined to efficient methods that seem to have always existed. The city hums not with the chaos of discovery, but with the confidence of routine, with the settled rhythms of proven techniques, with the satisfaction of work done according to long-established patterns. Writing itself emerges here suddenly, fully formed as a tool of administration rather than storytelling. The earliest tablets are not creation myths or hero tales, not love, poems, or wisdom literature. Not historical chronicles or divine revelations. They are bureaucratic records, contracts for land sales, inventories of livestock, receipts for tribute paid to temples, rosters of workers receiving rations, accounts of trade goods moved through temple warehouses. The script, cuneiform from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge, consists of combinations of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. It is supremely practical, adapted perfectly for the medium. Wet clay holds impressions without requiring the ink and pigment necessary for writing on papyrus or parchment. The wedge shape creates clear, distinct marks even when made quickly. The stylus, a carefully shaped reed, is simple to manufacture, requires no maintenance, and can be replaced instantly if broken. The medium clay tablets is literally dirt cheap, available in unlimited quantities in alluvial Mesopotamia. But practical perfection raises its own questions. The system seems designed with its medium in mind, as if writing and clay were invented together, co-evolved as mutually supporting technologies. Yet, writing is fundamentally about representing language, not about exploiting the properties of clay. How did the inventors arrive at this particular solution? Did they try other approaches, scratching symbols in sand, carving them in wood, painting them on walls before settling on pressed wedges in clay? If so, where is the evidence of these experiments? Moreover, the script is supremely efficient for representing Sumerian language. It is not a simple picture writing system where each symbol represents one word. It is syllabic. Many symbols represent sound combinations, syllables, that can be combined to write any word, including words never before written. This allows for representation of grammatical elements, proper names, technical terms, abstract concepts. It is writing capable of expressing the full complexity of language, not just recording limited categories of information. This level of sophistication appears immediately in the archaeological record. The earliest tablets we can read are already using the system at full capacity, already employing its complete range of possibilities. It is not picture writing gradually becoming more abstract, not simple symbols slowly acquiring phonetic values. It is, from the beginning, a functioning script capable of representing complex linguistic information. The earliest tablets document administrative transactions with linguistic precision. Consider what this means. The very first written documents we possess are not experimental gropings toward written expression, but functional, legal, and economic records that would be recognizable to a modern bureaucrat. They distinguish singular from plural. They mark possession. They specify quantities and qualities. They name individuals and their roles within the administrative hierarchy. They reference previous agreements and anticipate future obligations. Someone had to invent this system. Someone had to make the conceptual leap from visual symbol representing object to visual symbol representing sound. Someone had to analyze Sumerian language into its component syllables and assign symbols to represent those syllables. Someone had to establish conventions for how symbols combine, how ambiguities are resolved, how the system handles grammatical complexity. This is intellectual achievement of the highest order, requiring abstract thinking, systematic analysis, and sustained problem-solving. Yet the names of these inventors are not preserved. There is no myth of Thoth or Cadmus teaching humanity letters. There is no legendary scribe whose wisdom gifted humanity with writing. In later Mesopotamian tradition, writing is simply attributed to the gods, particularly Nabu, deity of wisdom and writing. But Nabu himself is not a creator god in these accounts. He is an administrator, a divine bureaucrat who records and preserves. The invention is elided, replaced with divine gift already perfect. The script avoids explanations of origin just as consistently as it documents current transactions. Sumerian tablets tell us how much grain moved from temple to warehouse, how many workers received rations, which fields were planted with what crops. They preserve contracts, legal judgments, administrative appointments, ritual schedules. The quantity of information is enormous. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered, representing only a fraction of what must have been produced. But in all this textual abundance, accounts of writing's invention are conspicuously absent. The priests who use this script record offerings made to gods with scrupulous care, describe the proper performance of rituals in exhaustive detail, copy out temple hymns that must be preserved exactly as received from tradition. But they avoid explanations of origin with remarkable consistency. They do not write. In the time of our grandfathers, the god Enki taught us the secret of writing. They do not preserve stories of the first scribe or the invention of the stylus or the discovery that wedges pressed in clay could represent sounds and meaning. They do not record the moment when symbol making crossed the threshold from accounting tokens to true writing. The omission is striking because priests are precisely the people we would expect to preserve such knowledge. They are the literate elite, the keepers of tradition, the ones responsible for maintaining continuity between past and present. Their entire social function is conservation of texts, of rituals, of cosmic order. Yet when it comes to origins, they are silent, or they offer only vague references to divine gift and primordial establishment. Consider the ritual texts that do survive. They describe with minute precision exactly how a ceremony must be performed, what offerings to present and in what order, what prayers to recite, and at what moment, what vestments to wear and how to purify them, where to stand and when to kneel, which instruments to play and which hymns to sing. Every gesture is specified, every variation noted and explained. These texts function as liturgical manuals, ensuring that rituals are performed identically across generations, preventing drift and deviation that might anger the gods or disrupt cosmic harmony. But while they tell us the how with exhaustive detail, they are largely silent on the why. Why must this particular offering be made? Why must the words be recited in this exact sequence? Why is this festival celebrated at this particular astronomical moment? The texts assume understanding rather than providing it. The practitioner is expected to know, or perhaps is expected simply to obey, with understanding being unnecessary or even undesirable for those outside the highest priestly circles. More crucially for our mystery, the texts never say, "This ritual was established in the reign of King X," or "The god first revealed this ceremony when the city was founded." They describe eternal practices, rituals that exist outside time, ceremonies that have always been performed and always will be. When they reference temporal origins at all, it is to say the ritual was established when heaven and earth were separated or ordained in the days before the flood, pushing origins back beyond memory, beyond history, into mythic time that cannot be historically verified. The tablets document what must be maintained, not what must be remembered in the sense of historical recollection. The distinction is crucial. Maintenance requires knowing how to perform current operations correctly. Remembering requires understanding how current operations came into being, what they replaced, why they were chosen over alternatives. The Sumerian textual tradition excels at the former and systematically avoids the latter. They are ledgers, not legends. Farmers maintain the irrigation canals according to schedules they inherited from their fathers, who inherited them from their fathers, who inherited them from sources now lost to memory, a chain of transmission stretching back beyond the reach of individual recollection into a communal past that exists more as practice than as narrative. The canals themselves are engineering marvels that reveal sophisticated understanding when examined closely. They are not simply ditches dug from river to field. They are precisely graded waterways, each section calculated to maintain flow velocity that prevents both stagnation and erosion. Too flat and sediment accumulates, choking the channel. Too steep and water flows with enough force to undercut banks and create breaches that can flood entire districts. The gradient required is subtle, often just a few centimeters of drop per kilometer. Yet it must be maintained consistently along channels that stretch for dozens of kilometers. Achieving this requires surveying technology, mathematical calculation, and practical experience of how water behaves under different conditions. The modern engineer, armed with levels, theodolites, and hydrological formulas, would find the task straightforward. The ancient engineer, working with sightlines, measuring rods, and accumulated knowledge, performed the same calculations and achieved results that endured for centuries. But beyond simple gradients, the canal system incorporates sophisticated features, distribution gates that allow water to be diverted into different channels as needed, settling basins where sediment can be captured before it enters narrow distribution channels, overflow systems that safely handle flood surges, drainage channels that prevent waterlogging of fields during rainy periods. Each of these features solves a specific problems that would only become apparent through long experience of what happens when such features are absent. Consider the distribution gates, simple mechanisms by which a physical barrier can be raised or lowered to control water flow. Simple in concept, but optimal design requires understanding. The strength needed to resist water pressure, the clearance necessary to prevent sediment buildup, the ease of operation so a single farmer can adjust flow without mechanical assistance. These requirements must be balanced too strong and the gate is immovable, too light and it fails under pressure. Too tight a fit and sediment jams it. Too loose and water leaks around it. Sumerian distribution gates met all these requirements. They worked day after day, season after season, managed by farmers who understood their operation without necessarily understanding their design principles. And this is the pattern we observe repeatedly. Functional technology operated according to inherited practice, with the development process invisible in the archaeological and textual record. The irrigation system also reveals planning at scales that transcend individual fields or even individual cities. Water diverted upstream affects availability downstream. Canals must be coordinated so that one district's usage doesn't compromise another's supply. During flood season, overflow must be managed collectively or everyone suffers. During drought, scarce water must be allocated according to agreements that balance competing needs. This coordination implies administrative infrastructure, social mechanisms for resolving conflicts, mathematical methods for measuring and distributing water fairly. It implies institutions that can make decisions binding on numerous communities, enforce those decisions, and maintain the physical infrastructure required for implementation. All of this must have developed over time, through negotiation and occasionally conflict, through trial and error, through the gradual establishment of norms and procedures. Yet, by the time we have written records, these institutions are already functioning smoothly. The texts document the administration of irrigation without explaining how that administration came to exist, without preserving the controversies and compromises that must have attended its establishment. Once again, we arrive at mature sophistication without visible developmental history. In the markets, merchants use standard weights and measures. A shekel of silver has an agreed value. A gur of grain represents a fixed volume. These standards facilitate trade across vast distances, connecting Uruk with cities throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. But there is no evidence of the negotiation and adjustment that should have produced such standardization. No competing measurement systems that were eventually unified. The standards appear already established, already accepted, already ancient. The urban planning itself suggests knowledge older than living memory. Principles of organization that seem to precede the cities they organize. Streets laid out in approximate grids, not perfect orthogonal geometry like a Roman military camp, but recognizable patterns of intersecting thoroughfares that divide the city into manageable districts. This is not the organic tangle of paths that develops when settlement grows haphazardly, each builder choosing the most convenient route without regard to overall pattern. This is intentional organization, the application of abstract planning principles to physical space. Residential districts are separated from sacred precincts by more than mere distance. They occupy different zones within the city's symbolic geography, distinguished by elevation, sacred buildings on higher ground, orientation temples, aligned to astronomical phenomena, while houses follow more practical considerations, and accessibility temple complexes, surrounded by walls with controlled entry points. This separation is not just functional, keeping noisy, messy domestic life away from sacred ritual, but cosmological, expressing in physical arrangement the fundamental distinction between human and divine realms. Public buildings occupy positions that maximize their administrative efficiency within the urban fabric. Granaries sit near canals for easy loading and unloading of boats that bring grain from rural districts. Markets cluster near city gates where traders arriving from other regions can easily access them. Administrative buildings stand adjacent to temple complexes, reflecting the intertwining of religious and economic authority. These are not accidental locations, but deliberate choices that reflect understanding of how cities function, how goods and people flow through urban space, how proximity facilitates certain interactions while distance enforces necessary separations. Workshops cluster by craft. creating specialized districts where potters work near potters, weavers near weavers, metal workers near metal workers. This clustering serves practical purposes. Apprentices can easily move between masters. Tools and techniques can be shared. Suppliers of raw materials know where to deliver goods. Customers know where to shop for specific items. But it also reflects economic understanding, that specialization increases efficiency, that competition drives quality, that clusters create centers of expertise that attract talent and investment. All of this represents applied knowledge, knowledge of urban dynamics, social organization, economic principles. Someone understood that cities work better when organized according to functional principles rather than allowed to grow chaotically. Someone grasped that separating incompatible land uses while clustering compatible ones creates both practical efficiency and social harmony. Someone recognized that infrastructure placement affects everything from trade patterns to social hierarchies to religious observance. This urban planning wisdom should have developed gradually, through experience of what works and what fails, through observation of how different arrangements affect city life, through accumulation of best practices refined across multiple construction projects. Yet Uruk displays sophisticated planning from its earliest phases that we can archaeologically access. It does not show the expected progression from unplanned village to partially organized town to fully designed city. It appears already mature in its spatial organization, already applying principles that suggest extensive prior experience. Ancient scribes, those whose clay tablets have survived 4 millennia in the dry earth, recorded the distribution of barley, beer, and silver without narrative flourish. Their prose is terse, functional, focused entirely on the practical necessities of administration. 3 gur of barley to the temple workers, 5 shekels of silver paid for copper ingots from Dilmun, 10 jars of beer allocated for the festival of Inanna. No metaphors grace these texts. No lyrical descriptions of golden fields or sacred drinks. Just data, preserved with care, transmitted with precision, serving the endless machinery of bureaucratic memory. The city functions like an institution older than human memory. It does not behave like a first attempt, a bold experiment in urban living. It behaves like a system that has already been refined through generations of practice. It has the confidence of maturity, the efficiency of long experience, and this creates a profound unease in those who study it. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the work we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, whether you're watching this in the quiet hours before dawn or during your lunch break or late at night when mysteries feel most potent. Your engagement helps us continue exploring these questions that haunt the boundaries between known history and forgotten time. The unease that ripples through scholarly circles stems from a simple but disturbing observation. Civilization appears fully formed. The archaeological record shows no gradual accumulation of urban sophistication. There should be layers of development, simple villages giving way to towns, towns expanding into cities, each stage building on the last, each generation adding innovations to inherited knowledge. Instead, there is a relatively sudden emergence of complexity. Cities appear with infrastructure already in place. Writing exists without obvious precursors. Administrative systems operate with practiced efficiency. Writing exists, but it avoids origins. The cuneiform tablets tell us how much grain is stored in temple granaries, who owes tribute to whom, which legal precedents govern property disputes. They do not tell us who invented the plough, or discovered bronze making, or first organized labor for large-scale irrigation. The silences are deafening. In a literate civilization, the absence of origin stories is itself a story of deliberate forgetting or catastrophic loss. Sumerian myths speak of restoration rather than creation. The gods do not invent civilization, they restore it, after disaster. The Eridu Genesis describes a flood that destroys the world, after which the gods re-establish kingship, rebuild cities, reinstate the proper order. The emphasis is always on return, on recovery, on the re-establishment of what was lost. Even the language suggests this. Sumerian texts refer to temples being rebuilt in locations where no earlier structure is archaeologically visible. They speak of renewing ancient foundations, of following primordial plans, of maintaining forms established when the heavens were separated from the earth. The bureaucracy dominates over wonder. In later civilizations, we find myths that explain how fire was stolen from the gods, how the alphabet was given to humanity, how agriculture began. But in Sumerian texts, these fundamental innovations are absent from the narrative tradition. There are no Prometheus figures. What we have instead are endless administrative records, ritual prescriptions, legal codes, all the machinery of maintenance, but none of the stories of invention. The Sumerian language itself presents a linguistic mystery. It has no known ancestors. It is what linguists call an isolate, a language that cannot be connected to any family of related languages. Indo-European languages form a family. Semitic languages form a family. But Sumerian stands alone, its grammar and vocabulary unlike anything else in the ancient Near East. This suggests either that it is the last survivor of a much older linguistic landscape, or that its speakers arrived from elsewhere, bringing a language developed in isolation. More strangely, the sacred city names resist translation into Sumerian. Eridu, one of the oldest cities, revered as the original seat of kingship. Nippur, the religious center where the god Enlil held court. Uruk itself. These names do not pass according to Sumerian linguistic rules. They are not compound words with clear meanings in Sumerian. They appear to be older than the language that speaks them, labels inherited from a previous layer of habitation, preserved through reverence even as their original meanings were lost. A core question arises, stark and unavoidable. Why does the first civilization refuse to describe its own beginning? Every culture tells origin stories. The Greeks had their golden age. The Romans traced their lineage to Trojan refugees. Medieval Europeans constructed genealogies reaching back to biblical patriarchs. Origin stories are how societies understand their identity, justify their customs, explain why things are the way they are. But Sumer, the world's first urban civilization, offers no account of how cities began, no myths of the first king, no tales of the invention of writing or agriculture or law. Historians express profound discomfort at this absence. The archaeological record should show gradual development pottery becoming more sophisticated over centuries, architecture growing more complex through trial and error, social organization increasing in scale and hierarchy as populations grow and economic systems evolve. This is how complex systems emerge in other contexts. But in southern Mesopotamia, there is instead a sudden plateau of sophistication. Cities appear already complex. Writing appears already functional. Administration appears already systematic. Archaeologists dig downward through time, seeking evidence of earlier, more primitive settlements that would represent the formative stages of urban civilization. They find flood layers, thick deposits of alluvial silt marking catastrophic inundations. These layers obscure what lies beneath, creating a horizontal barrier in time below which the archaeological record becomes fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Pre-flood settlements exist, certainly, but they are harder to access. Their remains disturbed or destroyed by subsequent flooding and construction. Organic materials decay, leaving only clay tablets, wood, rope, leather, papyrus, fabric. All the materials that might have recorded earlier stages of development all vanish in the hot, damp earth. Only clay survives, baked hard by the sun or by accidental fires, and clay tablets preserve administration rather than explanation. They tell us the what of Sumerian civilization, what was produced, what was traded, what was owed, but rarely the how or the why or the when it all began. Priests and kings focus on legitimacy, not origins. The texts that survive are those created by the literate elite for specific purposes: maintaining temple economies, recording royal achievements, prescribing religious rituals, codifying laws. These texts have a vested interest in presenting current arrangements as divinely ordained and eternal. Innovation threatens divine order. Change invites cosmic punishment. So the texts emphasize continuity, antiquity, adherence to primordial patterns. They do not celebrate novelty or preserve the names of inventors. Rituals maintain cosmic and civic order without explanation. The sacred calendar dictates when to plant and when to harvest, when to celebrate festivals and when to perform expiations. But the calendar is not explained. It is simply obeyed. The New Year festival involves specific processions, specific recitations, specific offerings. These are described in meticulous detail, but their origins are not discussed. They must be performed correctly because that is how they have always been performed, how the gods decreed they must be performed when the world was young. Written records preserve administration rather than origin. The thousands of tablets recovered from Sumerian sites overwhelmingly concern economic transactions, legal proceedings, and ritual protocols. They are the working documents of a functioning civilization: receipts, contracts, inventories, judgments, liturgies. They were never intended to serve as historical records for future generations. They were functional tools for contemporary use. And so they tell us how Sumerian civilization operated, but not how it began. Layers of history hint at events never recorded. Beneath the cities we can excavate are older layers, older walls, older pottery. These strata suggest continuous occupations stretching back before writing, before cities, into the deep Neolithic past. But the transition from these earlier phases to the urban civilization of Sumer is abrupt in archaeological terms. There is occupation, then there is sudden complexity, and between them, often, a flood layer. The audience must understand this. The first civilization behaves like the middle of a story. We arrive at a narrative already in progress, characters already in motion, systems already functioning. And when we ask, but how did this begin? What happened before? We encounter only silence, not the silence of missing evidence alone, but the silence of a civilization that chose not to remember, or that remembered loss too painful to record, or that knew its own beginning only as restoration after catastrophe. This is the enigma that haunts the cradle of civilization. This is the question that echoes down 4,000 years to trouble our understanding of human history. What happened before Uruk? What was forgotten? What was lost? And why does the world's first civilization refuse to tell us where it came from? To understand the mystery, we must first understand the world that produced it, a world strange to us in its assumptions, familiar to us in its outcomes, a world balanced precariously between order and chaos. Southern Mesopotamia stretches flat and featureless between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. No mountains break the horizon, no forests provide timber, no stone outcrops offer building materials. The land is alluvial plain silt deposited over millennia by the rivers flooding and receding, building up soil of remarkable fertility but also remarkable uniformity. It is a landscape of mud and water, reeds and sky, where human settlements rise, like islands from the marshes and the cultivated fields. The seasonal flooding dictates everything. In spring, snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia swells the rivers. The Euphrates and Tigris overflow their banks, inundating the plains, depositing fresh silt, and making agriculture possible. But the timing is cruel. The floods come too late for winter planting, too early for summer crops. Agriculture here requires intervention, control, the capture and redirection of water through human-made channels. Nature provides the water and the soil, but only human engineering can make them productive on a scale sufficient to support dense populations. Cities like Eridu, and Uruk serve as hubs of labor, trade, and ritual. They are not arbitrary locations, but strategic points in a landscape of water management. They sit on higher ground, safe from most floods. They command access to major canals. They serve as centers where agricultural surplus is collected, processed, and redistributed, grain converted to bread and beer, livestock slaughtered and preserved, crafts produced and traded. The cities are nodes in a network, each connected to the others through waterways and overland routes, each dependent on the others for resources lacking in the uniform landscape. Canals require careful maintenance using inherited engineering knowledge. Dig a canal too deep and the banks collapse. Too shallow and it silts up immediately. The gradient must be precise, steep enough for water to flow but gentle enough to prevent erosion. Control gates must regulate flow to prevent downstream flooding. The entire system must be coordinated across many settlements, since upstream use affects downstream availability. This is not knowledge that emerges spontaneously. It accumulates through generations of observation, experiment, and occasionally disastrous failure. Yet by the time of the earliest written records, the system already functions with mature efficiency. Predictable river patterns enable long-term settlement planning. The floods are seasonal and, in most years, manageable. This predictability allows for permanent settlements, multi-year construction projects, the accumulation of wealth in granaries and treasuries. Unlike environments where disasters strike without warning, Mesopotamia offers a kind of covenant with its inhabitants. Respect the rivers, maintain the canals, perform the rituals that ensure divine favor, and the land will support you. This predictability breeds civilization because civilization requires investment, and investment requires confidence that the future will resemble the past. The predictability also breeds conservatism. When systems work, change is dangerous. The canals that function must not be altered carelessly. The agricultural calendar that has proven reliable must not be adjusted on whim. The social hierarchies that coordinate labor and distribute resources must not be disrupted without grave cause. Innovation becomes suspect, experimentation risky. What has been proven through long use is sacred. What is new is potentially catastrophic. Scribes train in schools using repetitive exercises to master cuneiform. The curriculum is standardized across the Sumerian world. Students copy out the same practice texts, lists of signs, model contracts, excerpts from literary works. They memorize the shapes of hundreds of cuneiform signs, the combinations that represent syllables, the conventions that distinguish one type of document from another. The training is rigorous and lengthy years of practice before a scribe can be trusted with important documents. But the result is a professional class capable of maintaining written records across generations, ensuring continuity of administration even as individual scribes age and die. The education emphasizes reproduction, not creation. Students learn to copy accurately, not to compose freely. The goal is preservation of established forms. Variation is error. Creativity is deviation. A good scribe is one who can exactly replicate the models provided by his teachers, who can maintain the standards, who can ensure that a contract written in is recognizable and legally valid in Uruk. This educational philosophy serves the needs of administration beautifully. It does not serve the needs of historical memory. Priests perform daily rituals to maintain cosmic order and appease deities. The gods are not distant creators but active participants in the world, requiring constant attention and service. They must be fed offerings of bread, beer, meat, incense delivered at precise times according to liturgical calendars. They must be clothed, their cult statues dressed in fine garments. They must be honored with hymns and processions. Neglect invites divine wrath, floods, droughts, plagues, military defeat. The rituals are not symbolic. They are practical. In Sumerian cosmology, the world is maintained through continuous divine labor. The sun crosses the sky because the sun god Utu drives it. The crops grow because Ninurta provides agricultural abundance. The cities stand because Enlil grants them his protection. But divine attention must be secured through proper ritual. The gods are powerful, but also capricious, easily offended, sometimes forgetful. The rituals remind them of their obligations, placate them when they are angry, thank them when they are generous. Kings are described in records as restorers rather than inventors. A successful king does not boast of innovations, but of rebuilding ancient temples, redigging old canals, re-establishing proper rituals. King Urnamu declares that he restored Eridu according to its original plan. King Shulgi claims to have renewed the offerings to the gods, as in ancient days. The ideal king is a conservator, not a revolutionary. His legitimacy derives from his connection to the past, not his vision for the future. Temples double as economic centers managing grain, silver, and livestock. The temple is not only a house for the god, but also a warehouse, a workshop, a bank, and a redistributive hub. Farmers bring their tithes, portions of their harvest owed to the temple. Craftsmen produce goods commissioned by temple administrators. Merchants deposit silver for safekeeping. Workers receive rations of grain and beer in payment for labor on temple lands. The temple both serves the gods and serves society, intertwining religious and economic functions so thoroughly that they become inseparable. This dual function means the temple has an institutional memory independent of any individual. Administrators rotate, priests die and are replaced. Its archives preserve records of land ownership, debt obligations, ritual requirements. Its schools train new generations of scribes. Its granaries smooth out the variations between good and bad harvest years. The temple is a mechanism for transmitting knowledge and resources across time, making civilization possible even in the absence of strong central authority. Leaders enforce inherited systems rather than initiating innovation. Political authority is described as descending from the gods, not rising from the people. Kingship is a divine gift, bestowed by the gods after the flood to re-establish order. Kings rule not by invention of new laws, but by faithful administration of ancient customs. Their power is legitimate only insofar as they maintain the cosmic and social order decreed by the gods. A king who changes too much is a tyrant, disrupting the divinely established harmony. Kingship descends as divine authority already complete. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents, begins, "When kingship descended from heaven, not when it was invented or gradually developed, but when it descended, fully formed, a gift from the gods to humanity." This framing eliminates the possibility of human political innovation. Government is not something people create, it is something they receive, already perfected, in divine mind, requiring only faithful implementation. Ritual calendars are fixed and unalterable. The festivals must occur on their designated days. The liturgies must be recited with precise wording. The offerings must consist of specific items in specific quantities. Even if circumstances change, war disrupts trade routes, drought reduces harvests, flood destroys shrines, the rituals must continue as they always have. Flexibility is not piety, strict adherence is. Any deviation in practice risks divine punishment. The gods are jealous guardians of cosmic order. They established the me, the fundamental principles that govern reality, from kingship and priesthood to music and metalworking. Humans receive these principles but may not alter them. Innovation is transgression. Change is chaos. The proper human stance is gratitude for what has been given and vigilance in maintaining it exactly as received. The past is revered, and innovation is feared. Cultural heroes are not inventors, but restorers. The legendary kings of old are praised not for creating new institutions, but for re-establishing ancient ones after disruption. Progress, in the modern sense of continuous improvement and expanding knowledge, is not a cultural value. The golden age lies in the past, not the future. The task of each generation is not to surpass its ancestors, but to preserve what they achieved. Environmental balance is fragile. Small mismanagement could lead to disaster. The irrigation systems that make civilization possible are also vulnerabilities. Salinization, the accumulation of salt in soil from improperly managed irrigation, can render fields sterile within a generation. Breach a canal embankment during flood season and entire settlements can be destroyed. Neglect silt removal and canals become useless. The margin between thriving city and abandoned ruin is narrower than we imagine from our distance in time. Cultural memory is fragmented, relying on repeating administrative forms. Without writing, memory is oral, and oral tradition, powerful as it is, has limits. It preserves what is deemed important, what is regularly repeated. But administrative detail, technical specifications, the names of individuals outside the heroic tradition, these fade quickly. Writing supplements memory, but in selective ways, preserving transactions and rituals while allowing other knowledge to lapse into silence. Population growth and noise in cities cause anxiety reflected in flood myths. The Atrahasis epic explicitly states that the gods send the flood because human noise disturbs divine rest. The cities have grown too large, too loud, too numerous. The solution is drastic reduction. This myth reflects real urban anxieties, overcrowding, resource scarcity, environmental degradation, social disorder. The flood is both divine punishment and divine solution. A reset that restores balance by eliminating excess. The civilization's stability depends on adherence, not invention. The complex systems that support urban life, irrigation, administration, trade networks, ritual calendars, all require consistent maintenance and coordination. Introduce too much variation, and the systems break down. Coordination fails. Resources are misallocated. Social cohesion fractures. The society survives not through innovation, but through disciplined continuity. Each generation repeating what the previous generation perfected. Audiences observe. Uruk functions flawlessly but refuses to change. The city is a marvel of organization. Food flows from field to storehouse to distributor with minimal waste. Justice is administered according to consistent principles. Trade enriches merchants and temples. Temples employ thousands. The king maintains order. The gods receive their due. Everything works. But this success comes at a cost: rigidity. The system cannot adapt easily to new conditions because adaptation requires changing the sacred patterns. Routine and predictability dominate social, political, and religious life. The agricultural year follows the same cycle. The festivals occur in the same order. The legal cases invoke the same precedents. The hymns use the same formulas. The palace issues the same types of decrees. Life is ordered, comprehensible, stable. There is comfort in this, knowing what to expect, understanding one's role, trusting that the systems will function as they always have. But there is also fragility. A system optimized for one set of conditions becomes vulnerable when conditions change. A society that has forgotten why its institutions were established cannot easily reform them when they cease to serve. A culture that has ritualized knowledge cannot readily regenerate it when disasters strike. This is the world that produced the mystery, a world ordered, confident, efficient, and profoundly conservative. A world that worked so well it saw no need to remember how it was built. A world that revered the past so deeply it could not imagine surpassing it. A world balanced on the edge of a knife, where one catastrophic flood might erase centuries of accumulated knowledge, leaving survivors who could maintain systems without remembering origins. And this is exactly what the evidence suggests happened. The pivot point in this mystery appears in one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world, the Sumerian king list. The text is sober, bureaucratic, precisely the kind of administrative record you would expect from Sumerian scribes. It lists kings and the lengths of their reigns, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, marching through time toward the present. But the numbers are impossible. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,000 800 years. Alalgar, his successor, ruled for 36,000 years. The dynasty continues, with similar impossibilities, kings, reigning for tens of thousands of years in a sequence that stretches credulity, not just slightly, but grotesquely. Then comes a single line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After this line, the numbers drop precipitously. Post-flood kings have reigns measured in decades, not millennia. Etana of Kish rules for 1,500 years, still superhuman but approaching the realm of myth, rather than astronomical absurdity. Soon the numbers become almost plausible. 36 years, 25 years, 17 years. The text transitions from cosmic time to human time, from myth to history, without comment or explanation. The division is stark. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns. After the flood, human-scale time. The flood marks a reset, a discontinuity, a before and after so fundamental that even the nature of time itself seems to change. But what is being described? What does this division mean? Archaeological evidence confirms that flood layers exist in the stratigraphic record of Sumerian cities. Excavations at Uruk, Shuruppak, and other sites have revealed deposits of clean, water-laid silt, interrupting the accumulation of cultural debris. These are not ordinary floods, the seasonal inundations that the civilization was built to manage. These are catastrophic events that left layers of sterile sediment, sometimes meters thick, marking moments when normal habitation ceased. But the floods were not global. They were local or regional disasters, devastating to the cities they struck, but not to the world entire. Different sites show flood layers at different stratigraphic levels, indicating different events separated by decades or centuries. Yet in Sumerian cultural memory, these separate disasters have merged into the flood, singular and absolute, the disaster that divided time itself. Post-flood kings have human-scale reigns, marking a sudden historical reset. The king list treats this as simple chronology, just another transition from one dynasty to another. But the mathematics suggest something more profound. Before the flood, time is measured in a way we cannot understand, perhaps symbolically, perhaps using a different calendar system, perhaps inflated for theological reasons. After the flood, time behaves normally. The implication is that record-keeping itself changes, that the systems of memory and measurement are fundamentally altered. Gods act like regulators, not originators. In the flood myths, the gods do not create civilization, they destroy and then restore it. Enlil, king of the gods, decides humanity has become too numerous and noisy. He sends the flood to reduce population. But Enki, the wise god of fresh water and craft, warns the pious king Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on the version, to build an ark. Humanity survives through divine intervention, but only barely, and only the deserving remnant. After the waters recede, kingship is lowered from heaven once again. Cities are rebuilt. Sacrifices are reinstituted. The gods assign tasks. This god shall govern irrigation. That god shall oversee justice. This one shall watch over craft and commerce. The pantheon operates as a divine bureaucracy, each deity managing a domain, each ensuring that cosmic and earthly order align. They are regulators, overseers, maintainers of systems already established before time began. Mythological accounts describe destruction without explaining origin. The flood narratives focus on catastrophe and survival. They describe the building of the ark, the rising waters, the drowning of all life, the landing on the mountain, the offering of sacrifice, the divine promise not to destroy again. But they do not describe the world before the flood in any concrete way. What was destroyed? How did it function? What knowledge was lost? The myths are silent on these questions, interested only in the mechanism of destruction and the means of survival. Astronomy suggests something stranger still. The ziggurats are precisely aligned to celestial phenomena. Venus's 8-year cycle is carefully tracked. Lunar months are calculated with precision. The Pleiades, Orion, Sirius, all are observed, and their movements recorded. This astronomical knowledge appears immediately after the flood in the archaeological record, embedded in architecture, referenced in religious texts, fundamental to the calendar that governs agriculture and ritual. But astronomical observation requires long-term data collection. You cannot determine Venus's 8-year cycle without observing it for at least 8 years, ideally much longer, to confirm the pattern. The precision of Sumerian astronomy suggests centuries of accumulated observation. Yet this knowledge appears suddenly in the written record, already mature, already integrated into architecture and ritual. Where did it come from? Who observed and who remembered during the dark centuries before writing? Writing emerges soon after the flood, structured and urgent. The earliest tablets are not experimental, not clumsy first attempts. They are functional documents using a system already capable of representing complex linguistic information. The script allows for administrative precision, distinguishing singular from plural, indicating possession, marking grammatical relationships. This is not primitive picture writing but sophisticated information technology, and the content is urgent. These are not leisure time artistic experiments but practical necessities. Land sales that must be recorded, tribute that must be tracked, rations that must be distributed. The writing serves immediate administrative needs, suggesting it emerged in response to those needs or was recovered after a period when such record-keeping had lapsed. City layouts are rebuilt according to ancient templates. Archaeology shows that cities destroyed by flood are reconstructed in the same locations, often following the same street plans, with temples rebuilt on the same sacred sites. This is not random reoccupation but deliberate restoration. The rebuilders had knowledge of the previous layout, whether through physical ruins still visible above the flood line or through cultural memory preserved despite disaster. The temples particularly show this continuity. When a temple is rebuilt, it sits atop the ruins of earlier temples, sometimes incorporating older walls into new foundations, creating artificial mounds called tells that rise higher with each reconstruction. The sanctity of the location persists through destruction, suggesting that some knowledge survives at minimum, the knowledge of where the holy places stood. Administration fixes rituals permanently, avoiding experimentation. After the flood, there is an urgency to standardization. The rituals must be performed correctly, exactly as they were before, exactly as the gods require. Variation is too dangerous. The flood was punishment for disorder. Survival depends on re-establishing order. So the rituals are written down, fixed in clay, made permanent and unalterable. The law codes show the same impulse. The laws of Namu, one of the oldest legal codes, presents itself not as new legislation but as restoration of justice, as it was in former days. The king does not claim to invent law but to restore it, to re-establish the principles that governed before corruption set in. Even legislation frames itself as recovery, not innovation. Knowledge becomes standardized rather than creative. The scribal schools teach approved lists, lists of professions, lists of animals, lists of gods, lists of stars. These lists are the curriculum, memorized generation after generation. They preserve categories, taxonomies, the structure of knowledge, but they do not encourage addition or revision. The lists are complete, handed down from antiquity, requiring only faithful reproduction. This standardization serves preservation in the short term, but stifles development in the long term. Knowledge becomes fossilized, locked into forms that resist change. When conditions change, when new technologies emerge, when trade introduces new goods, when political realities shift, the old categories strain, but do not easily adapt. Later civilizations misinterpret Sumerians as inventors of civilization itself. To the Akkadians who succeed them, to the Babylonians who inherit their culture, to the Greeks who hear distant echoes of their achievements to all these later peoples, the Sumerians appear as originators. They invented writing, they invented law, they invented the city. This is how they are remembered, how they are praised, how they enter the mythology of human progress. But the Sumerians themselves did not make these claims. Their own texts speak of receiving these things, of restoring them, of maintaining them. They saw themselves as heirs, not innovators. They were custodians of knowledge, handed down from before the flood, from the antediluvian kings whose reigns stretched beyond normal time, from a past already ancient when memory began. Greeks and Romans assume origins where Sumerians practiced restoration. When classical writers encounter Mesopotamian traditions, they see beginnings. Babylon becomes the birthplace of astronomy. Becomes the origin of monotheism. The Mesopotamians become the teachers of humanity, the first to emerge from barbarism into civilization. But this is a misreading, a projection of later assumptions onto earlier realities. Written records prioritize survival of systems over explanation of beginnings. The thousands of tablets preserved from Sumerian cities concern themselves with maintaining institutions, not explaining their origins. Temple archives record offerings made, lands owned, workers employed. Royal inscriptions describe military campaigns, building projects, ritual observances. Legal documents codify procedures and precedents. But almost nowhere do these texts address the question of origins. They preserve the what and the how, but not the when or the why or the whence. Historical narrative begins midstream rather than at the beginning. We enter the story of Sumerian civilization already in progress. Cities functioning, writing, operating, laws enforced, gods worshipped, all without preamble or introduction. It is as if the curtain rises on Act 2 of a play whose first act has been lost. We can follow the plot from this point forward, but we can never fully understand the setup, the context, the origins of the conflicts we witness. Human experience is subordinated to continuity of administration. What matters in the Sumerian worldview is the maintenance of systems, the temple economy, the irrigation network, the royal succession, the ritual calendar. Individual lives are relevant only as they serve these larger structures. The scribes who maintain the systems are anonymous, their personalities erased in favor of institutional continuity. Silence replaces explanation in administrative and religious texts. Where we expect commentary, we find only prescription. Where we hope for history, we find only liturgy. The texts tell us what must be done, but not why it must be done, or how it came to be required. The silence is not accidental, but structural, built into the very purpose of writing as the Sumerians employed it. Memory becomes ritualized, fixed in clay rather than narrative. The knowledge that survives is the knowledge that serves administration and worship lists, procedures, formulas, prayers. These are preserved not as history but as perpetual present, as instructions for correct performance, as templates to be endlessly repeated. They constitute a form of memory, certainly, but a very specific kind: procedural memory, ritualized memory, memory in service of continuity rather than understanding. Civilization preserves itself while erasing its early chapters. The very success of Sumerian systems ensures that origins become irrelevant. If something works, who cares how it was invented? If a ritual maintains cosmic order, why question its origins? The focus on function over history allows civilization to survive, but at the cost of self-knowledge. Historians realize that history's direction had already shifted before writing began. By the time we have written sources, we are already in the aftermath. The formation of civilization, the development of its fundamental technologies and institutions, the process by which scattered villages became coordinated cities, all of this happened before there were scribes to record it, or happened and was then forgotten in catastrophe. The flood becomes a pivot point, not creation, but reorganization. It marks the transition from a world we cannot access to a world we can partially reconstruct. Before the flood, long rains and astronomical time. After the flood, human history. Before the flood, origins lost in myth. After the flood, administration preserved in clay. The flood is not the beginning of civilization, but the beginning of civilization's memory of itself, and that memory begins with loss, with disaster, with survival in the aftermath. The aftermath of the flood, whether literal catastrophe or symbolic representation of cultural discontinuity, creates patterns that compound across centuries, each generation inheriting constraints that become more rigid, more invisible, more fundamental to identity. Law codes emphasize continuity with pre-flood society. The laws of Ur-Nammu, compiled around 2100 BC, are among the oldest legal codes to survive. They address practical matters: murder, theft, divorce, slave ownership, property rights. But the framing is significant. The king claims not to invent these laws, but to restore justice as it was in the days of old, to re-establish equity that had been corrupted or forgotten. Law is presented as recovery of ancient standards, not progressive reform. This rhetorical strategy serves political purposes. It grants the king's edicts the authority of antiquity, making them seem natural and inevitable rather than arbitrary and imposed. But it also reflects a genuine worldview. Justice exists eternally in divine mind. Human laws are just to the degree they align with these eternal principles. Innovation in law is suspect because it suggests deviation from cosmic order. The good king rediscovers and applies what was always true. Architecture repeats older forms, maintaining visual and symbolic order. When temples are rebuilt, they follow previous plans. Ziggurats maintain proportions established in earlier iterations. Palace layouts conform to traditional arrangements of throne room, audience hall, private quarters, and administrative offices. Even domestic architecture shows remarkable conservatism. The courtyard house design that emerges in early Sumerian periods persists with minimal modification for millennia across Mesopotamia. This architectural conservatism is partly practical. Why redesign what works? But it is also ideological. Buildings are not just shelters, they are cosmic symbols. A temple is a mountain connecting earth to heaven. A palace is the mortal reflection of divine kingship. A ziggurat orients the city to the stars, and thus to the gods who govern them. Altering these forms risks disrupting the correspondences they embody, breaking the sympathetic magic that links human realm to divine cosmos. Schools enforce memorization and repetition rather than innovation. Scribal education consists of copying standard texts over and over until the student can reproduce them perfectly. Model contracts, literary excerpts, lexical lists, all are committed to memory through endless repetition. The training produces scribes capable of maintaining bureaucratic continuity, but not necessarily capable of original composition or critical analysis. This educational method has advantages. It ensures standardization across a far-flung civilization. A scribe trained in Ur can work in Uruk, and his documents will be recognizable and valid. It preserves texts that might otherwise be lost. Copying is an act of transmission as well as training, but it also fossilizes knowledge, making the canonical texts fixed and unchangeable. Beyond critique or improvement, novelty is discouraged to prevent divine or social disorder. Innovation in religion is blasphemy. Innovation in administration is incompetence. Innovation in craft might be acceptable if it improves efficiency, but even then it must not violate traditional forms or interrupt established practices. The conservatism operates at every level of society, enforced by religious sanctions, social norms, and practical considerations. The fear of novelty is not irrational in this context. The civilization depends on coordination. Thousands of farmers must plant at the right time, or the irrigation system fails. Hundreds of craftsmen must produce standardized goods, or trade becomes impossible. Dozens of scribes must use identical accounting methods, or the temple economy collapses. Variation is friction. Uniformity is efficiency. In a world with narrow margins for error, experimentation is dangerous. Oral histories erode as writing replaces memory. Before writing, knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, songs, genealogies, proverbs. This oral culture was rich and sophisticated, capable of preserving vast amounts of information through mnemonic techniques and formulaic language. But it was also vulnerable. Information not regularly repeated was lost. Details changed gradually as stories adapted to new audiences. Writing supplements and eventually supplants oral tradition. Once information is recorded in clay, it need not be memorized. This frees mental resources but also weakens the cultural practices that maintained oral memory. The songs are no longer sung because the lists are written down. The genealogies are no longer recited because the temple archives preserve them. And gradually, the living tradition dies, replaced by the frozen archive. What is lost in this transition is context, nuance, the interpretive frameworks that gave meaning to bare facts. An oral tradition doesn't just preserve information. It preserves the community's relationship to that information, the emotional and social significance embedded in the telling. Writing captures data but often loses meaning. Archaeologists encounter temporal walls beyond which origins cannot be traced. The flood layers create a practical barrier. Earlier deposits are disturbed, fragmentary, difficult to date and interpret. The deeper you dig, the less certain the chronology becomes. At some point, you reach levels where the evidence is simply too sparse and ambiguous to construct coherent narratives. This temporal wall is not absolute archaeology, continues to push it back, finding older sites, refining dating methods, extracting information from ever more marginal evidence. But for the Sumerians themselves, the barrier was absolute. Without writing, without radiocarbon dating, without stratigraphic excavation, they could not access their own deep past. They could remember through myth and ritual, but they could not verify, could not correct, could not expand their understanding of origins. Earlier settlement layers are destroyed by floods or erosion. The violence of water is matched by the slower violence of abandonment. When a city is left empty, wind and rain erode mud brick walls, roofs collapse, structures dissolve back into the earth from which they were built. Within generations, all that remains are mounds of rubble, indistinguishable from natural hills except to the trained eye. The rivers themselves are agents of destruction, changing course over centuries, undercutting ancient settlements, burying others under alluvium. The landscape of southern Flod, Mesopotamia, is unstable on long timescales, constantly reshaped by the very forces that made it fertile. Cities that once sat on riverbanks now stand miles from any water. Canals silted up and abandoned leave only faint traces in aerial photography. Cultural confidence masks existential loss. The Sumerians were successful, powerful, creators of a civilization that would endure in modified forms for 3,000 years. Their confidence was earned. They had solved the problems of urban living, organized labor on unprecedented scales, produced art and literature of sophistication and beauty. They had every reason to believe their way of life was superior, divinely favored, eternal. But underneath the confidence was a void, the absence of origin stories, the silence about beginnings, the fact that their entire civilization rested on foundations they could not explain. This did not trouble them consciously, or if it did, they left no record of such anxieties. But it troubles us, viewing their achievement from our distance in time, seeing the gap where we expect to find creation, myths and foundation legends. Citizens inherit systems whose origins are unknowable. The farmers who maintain canals do not know who first designed them. The scribes who use cuneiform do not know who invented it. The priests who perform rituals do not know when they were first established. They inherit practices that work, that their ancestors used, that the gods command. This is sufficient. Functionality trumps understanding. In a stable society, this ignorance is unproblematic. As long as the systems continue to work, origins are merely academic questions. But when crisis strikes, when systems fail, when new challenges demand adaptation rather than repetition, then ignorance becomes dangerous. Without understanding why something was designed the way it was, you cannot intelligently modify it. You can only maintain or discard. Writing replaces living memory, codifying practice over understanding. The tablets tell you how to perform a ritual, what offerings to make, what words to recite, what procession to follow, but they do not tell you why the ritual was instituted, what problem it was meant to solve, what alternatives were considered and rejected. The procedural knowledge is preserved, the reasoning behind it is lost. This creates fragility. A written procedure can be followed mindlessly, generation after generation, long after the original context has changed and the procedure has become obsolete or even counterproductive. But without understanding the purpose, no one recognizes the obsolescence. The ritual continues because it is written, because it is tradition, because it would be sacrilege to change it, regardless of whether it serves any function. Civilization survives but loses knowledge of its first chapters. This is the paradox. Sumerian civilization succeeds magnificently while remaining ignorant of its own origins. It is a tree that has forgotten its roots, a river that does not remember its source. The institutions function, the cities thrive, the culture flourishes, but the beginning is lost, irretrievable, locked behind the flood that reset time. Ritual and bureaucracy maintain social cohesion in absence of narrative. What holds Sumerian society together is not shared understanding of origins, but shared practice. Everyone participates in the same festivals, follows the same laws, pays taxes to the same temples, acknowledges the same gods. This shared participation creates community, even without shared narrative of how the community began. Ritual is powerful precisely because it does not require belief in the same sense that later religions will demand. You do not need to understand or even intellectually assent to the mythology behind a ritual to participate in it effectively. You need only perform the prescribed actions. The doing creates the meaning. The repetition across generations creates continuity. Bureaucracy operates similarly. You do not need to believe in the justice of a law to obey it, only to understand that obedience is rewarded and disobedience punished. You do not need to understand the economic theory behind taxation to pay your share, only to recognize the consequences of tax evasion. Administration creates order through enforcement of procedures, not through persuasion or conversion. Silence becomes central to cultural identity. What defines Sumerian civilization is not what it says about itself, but what it does not say. The refusal to mythologize origins, the focus on present function over past history, the insistence on maintenance over innovation, these silences shape Sumerian culture as profoundly as the famous inventions writing, law, city, for which they are remembered. The silence is not absence but presence, the active choice not to speak about certain things, not to question certain givens, not to probe beneath the surface of inheritance. It is a cultural strategy, perhaps unconscious but nonetheless effective. By treating the past as sacred and unalterable, the Sumerians protect themselves from the vertigo of infinite possibility that comes with acknowledging contingency. The loss of origins passes unnoticed by contemporary inhabitants. They do not experience their ignorance as loss because they have never known anything else. To them, it is simply how things are. Kingship descends from heaven. Writing exists. Cities function. These are facts as fundamental and unremarkable as sunrise. Only we, peering back across 4 millennia, recognize the strangeness, the civilization that appears fully formed, that refuses to explain itself, that operates like an amnesia patient who has forgotten their childhood but functions normally in the present. This is the compounding consequence of the turning point. A civilization that survives by forgetting, that thrives through ritualized ignorance, that maintains itself by refusing to question its foundations. The strategy works for centuries, perhaps millennia. The cities endure. Later civilizations inherit and adapt Sumerian achievements without understanding their origins, because the Sumerians themselves did not understand or did not record them. But the forgetting comes at a cost. It creates a vulnerability, a blind spot in cultural consciousness. When eventually Sumerian civilization declines, conquered by Akkadians, absorbed into Babylonian and Assyrian empires, its language becoming a dead tongue known only to scholarly priests, something irreplaceable is lost. Not just the civilization itself, but the knowledge of how it began, how the first humans organized themselves into cities, how writing was invented, how law emerged from custom, how religion evolved from animism to polytheism, how all the fundamental achievements of urban life first occurred. These origins are lost, not despite Sumerian success, but because of it. The civilization worked so well that remembering beginnings became unnecessary. And by the time outsiders thought to ask, by the time Greeks and Romans and eventually modern archaeologists became curious about origins, the Sumerians who might have answered were 4,000 years dead, and their silence had become permanent. What remains when the story ends? What do we actually know, with confidence, about the civilization that chose not to remember its own beginning? The Sumerians shaped law, timekeeping, and astronomy in ways that echo through history to the present day. Their legal innovations, written contracts, codified penalties, standardized procedures, establish patterns that Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman law will follow. The principle that law should be written, public, and consistently applied, rather than arbitrary and secret, begins here in the mud brick cities of southern Mesopotamia. Their timekeeping divides the day into 12 double hours, the hour into 60 minutes, the circle into 360 degrees. This sexagesimal base 60 counting system, convenient for division and calculation, embeds itself so deeply in mathematical practice that we still use it 4 millennia later. Every time you glance at a clock or measure an angle, you participate in a Sumerian inheritance. Their astronomy tracks Venus cycles, lunar months, stellar positions with precision that suggests centuries of careful observation. The zodiac, the 7-day week, the correspondence between planets and gods, all these have roots in Mesopotamian skywatching. The priests who climbed ziggurats to observe the heavens were not just performing religious duties, they were conducting scientific research, accumulating data that would ground both astrology and astronomy for centuries. Their systems endure globally. The influence spreads through conquest and cultural transmission. When Alexander the Great conquers Babylon, Greek scholars encounter Mesopotamian astronomical records and mathematical methods, which they translate and transmit to the wider Hellenistic world. When Islamic scholars centuries later collect and preserve ancient knowledge, Sumerian, Babylonian mathematics and astronomy are among their treasures. When European mathematicians, in the medieval and Renaissance periods, rediscover classical learning, they inherit, often unknowingly, Sumerian innovations filtered through multiple layers of translation and transmission. The law codes of Hammurabi, the astronomical observations of Babylon, the mathematical methods of the cuneiform tablets all rest on Sumerian foundations, often explicitly referencing ancient practices, or as it was in former days. The Sumerians are the base layer, the beginning of a tradition that continues unbroken through conquest and cultural change, a thread connecting the ancient world to modernity. Their influence is undeniable. Cities everywhere echo Sumerian patterns. Concentrated populations supported by agricultural hinterlands, specialized labor organized through administration, monumental architecture expressing civic and religious identity, markets facilitating trade, legal systems maintaining order. These patterns emerge independently in other regions, the Indus Valley, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, but in the Near East and through Near Eastern influence in Europe, the patterns trace back to Sumerian precedents. But alongside this documented influence, alongside these celebrated achievements, lies a vast darkness, what was lost. Pre-Sumerian voices are erased. Before the cities, there were villages. Before the villages, nomadic groups. Before agriculture, hunter-gatherers. These earlier peoples left material remains pottery, tools, burial sites, but no words. Their languages are lost. Their myths are forgotten. Their names for gods and heroes and sacred places have vanished. The transition from Neolithic villages to Sumerian cities spans millennia, but we cannot hear the voices of those who lived through it. We see the archaeological progression, pottery styles changing, settlement sizes increasing, social complexity growing, but the human experience behind these changes is silent. What did they think as populations concentrated? How did they negotiate the first hierarchies, the first inequalities, the first surrendering of autonomy to central authority? We can speculate, but we cannot know. Early innovations are undocumented. Who first smelted copper? Who bred sheep for wool rather than just meat? Who invented the plow? Who discovered that clay could be fired to permanent hardness? Who first hollowed out a tree trunk to make a boat? These are among humanity's most significant technological achievements, each one enabling subsequent developments. Each one representing insight, experiment, and successful implementation. But the names of the innovators are lost. The circumstances of their discoveries are forgotten. The failures that preceded success, the alternatives that were tried and abandoned, the social resistance that had to be overcome, all erased. We inherit the technologies without the stories of their invention, like finding a library where all the title pages have been removed. The first chapter of civilization is missing. We can read the second chapter, the third, the 100th. We can trace the fall of Sumerian dynasties, the rise of Akkad, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian conquests, the Persian absorption, the Hellenistic transformation, the gradual decline into obscurity. We can follow the continuous thread of urban civilization in Mesopotamia for 3,000 years of recorded history. But the first chapter, the one where scattered villages become coordinated cities, where oral tradition becomes writing, where custom becomes law, where shamanism becomes organized priesthood, where chieftainship becomes kingship, that chapter is lost. We know it must have happened. The evidence that it happened is all around us. But the how and the why and the who remain obscure. Competing theories attempt to fill this void, each plausible, none fully satisfying. The lost advanced civilization hypothesis proposes that Sumerian sophistication reflects inheritance from an earlier, more advanced culture now vanished, perhaps a maritime civilization. Its cities now underwater due to sea level rise after the last ice age. Perhaps a catastrophic flood, whether Noah's or a proto-memory of post-glacial flooding destroyed this precursor civilization, and survivors transmitted fragmented knowledge to the Sumerians, who preserved it without fully understanding it. This theory explains the apparent absence of developmental stages, the sudden appearance of sophisticated systems, the Sumerian references to restoring rather than inventing. It resonates with myths of golden ages and antediluvian wisdom found in many cultures. But it lacks direct evidence. No ruins of this hypothetical advanced civilization have been found. The flood layers in Mesopotamia are real but local, not global. And comparative archaeology suggests that the sophistication of Sumerian civilization can be explained through gradual development, even if we cannot trace every step. The gradual development hypothesis argues that civilization did develop gradually over millennia, but evidence was erased by subsequent disasters. Flooding, erosion, and continuous occupation destroyed earlier layers. Organic materials decayed. Pre-literate phases left no written record. What appears as sudden emergence is an artifact of preservation bias. We see only what survived, not the longer process that led to it. This theory aligns with archaeological method and comparative evidence from other regions where urban development can be traced more completely. It is the scholarly consensus, the sober assessment of available evidence, but it struggles to explain some anomalies. The linguistic isolation of Sumerian, the suddenness with which complex writing appears, the absence of origin myths, the references in Sumerian texts to restoring rather than establishing institutions. The symbolic myth hypothesis treats the flood narrative and pre-flood chronology as mythic constructions rather than historical memories, symbolic representations of cultural transitions rather than literal events. The flood represents the transition from prehistory to history, from oral to written culture, from mythic to administrative consciousness. The pre-flood kings with impossible lifespans represent a golden age, an imagined past of perfection against which the present can be measured and found wanting. This theory takes seriously the religious and literary dimensions of Sumerian texts, resisting the temptation to read them as failed history or confused science. It recognizes that ancient peoples thought differently, categorized reality differently, and that imposing modern distinctions between history and myth may distort their meaning. But it risks dismissing too readily the possibility that the myths preserve genuine historical memories, distorted but not entirely invented. The environmental collapse hypothesis focuses on evidence for climate change at the end of the Neolithic: increased aridity, changing river courses, soil degradation. These environmental pressures might have destroyed earlier settlements while simultaneously driving innovations in irrigation and social organization. The flood might represent cultural memory of environmental crisis, not a single catastrophe, but a period of recurring disasters that reshaped the landscape and forced adaptation. This theory has the advantage of grounding explanation in materialist causes that leave physical evidence. Climate science and geoarchaeology support the reality of significant environmental changes in the region during the relevant period. But environmental determinism can be reductive, and the theory struggles to account for cultural specificities. Why Sumerians developed the institutions they did rather than other responses to similar pressures. No theory explains everything. Each captures part of the truth. Perhaps civilization did develop gradually, but key phases of that development occurred in areas now destroyed or submerged. Perhaps a significant flood or series of floods did disrupt cultural transmission, creating genuine discontinuity while also inspiring later symbolic elaboration. Perhaps environmental stress did drive innovation while also destroying evidence of earlier adaptations. Perhaps the Sumerians themselves, in their effort to make sense of their own past, created narratives that mixed memory and imagination in ways we can no longer disentangle. The uncertainty is not mere ignorance that might be dispelled by more research. Though research continues and sometimes surprises, it is structural uncertainty, the consequence of temporal distance and the selectivity of preservation. Some questions about origins may be, in principle, unanswerable with available evidence. This is unsettling for modern consciousness, which expects that every question has an answer, that every problem has a solution, that the past is fundamentally knowable if sufficient effort is applied. But the Sumerian silence reminds us that some knowledge, once lost, cannot be recovered. The past is not always accessible to us. There are gaps in the human story that cannot be filled, only acknowledged. The legacy of uncertainty shapes how we understand not just Sumerians but ourselves. Modern society mirrors Sumerian bureaucracy more than we might like to admit. Our institutions are often maintained by functionaries who understand procedures but not purposes, who can execute protocols but cannot explain their origins. We too preserve systems whose founding rationales have been forgotten, whose original contexts have been lost. We too face the challenge of balancing preservation and innovation. Our legal systems, like Sumerian law codes, reference precedent and tradition, while struggling to adapt to changing circumstances. Our cities, like Uruk, are maintained through inherited infrastructure whose replacement or fundamental redesign seems impossibly difficult. Our knowledge, like cuneiform tablets, is increasingly stored in formats that require specialized training to access digital archives that might be as opaque to future generations as Sumerian tablets were to medieval scholars. Humanity still rebuilds after collapse. The pattern the Sumerians established, catastrophe followed by restoration, disaster followed by recovery, repeats through history. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is lost and partially recovered. Cities are destroyed and rebuilt. The flood, whether literal or metaphorical, remains a recurring motif, a pattern we cannot escape. And like the Sumerians, we often rebuild by recovering fragments of what was lost rather than inventing entirely anew. The Renaissance recovers classical learning. The Industrial Revolution recovers and mechanizes craft knowledge. The digital revolution recovers and accelerates information processing. Even our innovations often turn out to be rediscoveries, ideas that had occurred to earlier thinkers and been forgotten, technologies that had been anticipated but not implemented. Absence defines understanding. What we know about Sumerians is shaped as much by what we don't know as by what we do. The gap in their story is itself part of the story. The mystery of their origins becomes inseparable from their achievement. They are defined not just by their inventions, but by the silence surrounding those inventions, not just by what they created, but by what they chose not to remember or could not preserve. This absence haunts the historical record. It creates a longing, a desire to fill the gap, to complete the story, to know what happened before Uruk raised its ziggurats to the stars. It drives archaeology, motivates research, inspires speculation, but it also teaches humility, the recognition that some questions transcend available evidence, that certainty has limits, that mystery is sometimes all we have. The Sumerians give us law and writing and cities and astronomy. They also give us this, the knowledge that civilization can flourish while forgetting its own beginning, that systems can function without understanding, that humanity can achieve greatness while remaining ignorant of how that greatness first emerged. This is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests resilience. We can lose knowledge and still survive, still rebuild. Terrifying because it suggests fragility. What we take for granted might rest on foundations we don't understand, and those foundations might collapse without warning, leaving future generations to puzzle over our ruins as we puzzle over Sumerian tablets. Return with me to Uruk, not the ruins that tourists visit today. Wind-scoured mounds rising from Iraqi desert, cuneiform tablets locked in climate-controlled museum cases. Return to Uruk as it was, streets bustling with purpose, canals flowing, scribes recording, priests ascending ziggurat stairs to observe the stars. The scene is orderly, too orderly. Everything functions with the smoothness of long practice, the precision of inherited knowledge, the confidence of systems refined through generations. But walk those streets and listen carefully to the silence beneath the noise. The merchants haggling over silver prices do not speak of the first markets. The scribes copying out tax records do not preserve stories of writing's invention. The priests chanting hymns do not sing of the gods teaching those hymns to the first priests. Writing is everywhere, pressed into soft clay that hardens to permanent record. But writing serves preservation, not invention. It maintains what exists rather than explaining how what exists came to be. The tablets record rations of barley distributed, fields planted with seed, tribute paid by subject villages. They do not record the moment someone first realized that marks on clay could represent spoken language, could preserve thought across time, could coordinate human activity across space. The function has been perfected, the origin has been forgotten, or perhaps never recorded, or perhaps recorded and lost in flood layers, now meters beneath the foundations of the city. We cannot know which, and the Sumerians themselves might not have known. This is what haunts. Not just that we lack answers, but that a civilization could flourish without asking the questions. That writing could exist without myths of its invention. That law could be codified without stories of the first lawgiver. That cities could stand without legends of the first builders. The Sumerians apparently felt no need for such stories. Or if they felt the need, they satisfied it with references to divine gift and ancient restoration rather than human innovation and historical development. Was civilization a beginning or a recovery? This is the question that echoes across 4 millennia. Did the Sumerians invent urban life, or did they inherit and restore it? Did they create writing, or did they recover and systematize it after a period when such knowledge had lapsed? Did they establish law, or did they codify customs already ancient? The archaeological evidence can be read both ways. Gradual development is plausible, but so is recovery after catastrophic loss. Cultural continuity is likely, but so is profound disruption. The flood layers are real. The references to restoration are consistent. The absence of origin myths is striking, yet complex systems rarely emerge fully formed, and the Sumerian achievement fits patterns of urban development seen elsewhere. Perhaps the answer is both. Perhaps civilization developed gradually over millennia, but a catastrophic flood or series of floods disrupted that development, destroying enough physical evidence and cultural memory that survivors genuinely did not know their own origins. Perhaps they rebuilt using inherited knowledge, practical techniques for irrigation and architecture and administration, while losing the stories of how that knowledge was first acquired. This would explain the paradox. Sophisticated systems without documented origins, mature technologies without visible development, confident mastery without creation myths. They rebuilt what they half remembered, restored what had been lost, maintained what they could salvage, and in the process, created a civilization that worked beautifully while being fundamentally amnesiac about its own past. Or perhaps there is no paradox. Perhaps we impose our own expectations of how civilization should develop, and the Sumerian reality simply differed. Perhaps they genuinely did not value origin stories the way later cultures would. Perhaps their focus on ritual repetition and administrative continuity reflected a worldview so foreign to our own that we mistake their silence for forgetting when it was actually choice, the choice to value present function over past history, maintenance over innovation, stability over the dangerous allure of endless questioning. In the end, we are left where we began, in Uruk's streets, surrounded by evidence of achievement and haunted by absence of explanation. The city works, the civilization thrives, the systems function, but the beginning remains obscure, locked behind a barrier of time and silence that we cannot penetrate. And somewhere between what was remembered and what was already gone, civilization learned to survive without knowing how it began and taught us to do the same. We inherit their legacy, not just in our 60-minute hours and our written laws, but in our own occasional amnesia about origins, our own focus on function over foundation, our own tendency to maintain systems we can no longer fully explain. The Sumerian mystery is ultimately a human mystery. How do we create and forget? How do we build and lose understanding? How do we preserve systems while forgetting their purposes? These questions apply not just to ancient Mesopotamia, but to every civilization, every institution, every tradition that has outlived the memory of its founding. The ziggurat still rises in imagination, precisely aligned to stars whose movements we still track using Sumerian mathematics. The canals still flow in principle, their engineering embedded in every irrigation system that has followed. The tablets still speak, their cuneiform signs deciphered by scholars who have recovered the ability to read a dead language. But the first scribe remains nameless. The first king's tomb is unmarked. The invention of the plough is undocumented. The moment when village became city is lost in the gap between archaeological layers, and the civilization that gave us writing used that writing to record everything except its own beginning. This is the gift of Sumer, paradoxical and profound. The knowledge that we can live without answers, can function without understanding, can achieve greatness while remaining ignorant of our own origins, and the warning that what we build without remembering how we built it, we may not be able to repair when it breaks, may not be able to rebuild when it falls. Somewhere in the dust of southern Mesopotamia, beneath layers of silt and ruin, beneath centuries of occupation and abandonment, beneath the weight of 4,000 years, somewhere down there lies the answer. The tablets that would explain, the layer that would clarify, the evidence that would resolve the mystery. Or, perhaps not. Perhaps the answer never existed. Perhaps the Sumerians themselves did not know their origins, inheriting systems they could not explain, maintaining traditions whose purposes were already forgotten, performing rituals whose meanings had been lost before memory began. Either way, the silence persists. The question remains unanswered. The first chapter is missing, and no amount of excavation or analysis or speculation will restore what was never recorded or what was recorded and lost. We stand in the aftermath, sorting through fragments, reading signs, pressed into clay by hands long turned to dust, trying to reconstruct a story that begins in the middle and offers no prologue. This is what the Sumerians leave us: achievement wrapped in mystery, sophistication shrouded in silence, civilization emerging fully formed from a past we cannot access, and they apparently chose not to preserve. The stars still move in cycles the Sumerian priests calculated. The laws still echo principles Sumerian scribes codified. The cities still follow patterns Sumerian planners established. The influence endures, undeniable and profound, but the beginning remains hidden, the origin obscure, the first moment forever lost in the gap between what can be remembered and what must be forgotten for civilization to continue. And in that gap, in that silence, in that absence at the heart of our earliest recorded history, we find not just a mystery about ancient Mesopotamia, but a mirror reflecting our own relationship to the past, our own balance between memory and forgetting, our own tendency to preserve what works while losing the knowledge of how it came to work. The Sumerians built on foundations they could not explain. So do we. They maintained systems whose origins they did not know. So do we. They created magnificence while forgetting or never recording how that magnificence first emerged. And we inherit their legacy. The achievement and the silence both. The gifts and the gaps. The knowledge and the mystery inextricably intertwined. Uruk streets grow quiet as imagination releases them back to dust. The scribes set down their stylus for the last time. The priests descend from the ziggurat. The canals run dry. The clay tablets harden and wait, patient as stone, for future hands to lift them into light. And the question remains, whispered by wind across ruins, carved into every fragment we recover. Where did it begin? How did it start? What came before? The answer, if it ever existed, is lost. The silence, profound and permanent, is all that remains. And we are left to wonder, as perhaps the Sumerians themselves wondered, whether civilization begins with a grand invention or a humble recovery, a bold creation or a patient restoration of what was known and lost and painstakingly reassembled from fragments of forgotten time. The mystery endures, the absence defines. The first civilization refuses, even now, even across the barrier of 4 millennia, to tell us how its story truly began. And that refusal, that silence, that gap in the record, this is perhaps the most profound lesson Sumer teaches, that we can create wonders we cannot explain, build systems we do not fully understand, and pass to our descendants both our achievements and our ignorance, both our triumphs and our silences, both the gift of civilization and the mystery of its forgotten origins.